And if you've rented for long enough, you've probably had to deal with just an absolutely horrible landlord at some point. Maybe they've unexpectedly raised your rent on you, they try to evict you, maybe they've refused to fix or get rid of mold, rats, roaches, flooding, broken elevators, anything that sucks for you and costs them money. But what if I told you there was a way to fight back called a tenant union? Or we've all heard and seen labor unions, and it's kind of like that. But instead of coworkers organizing against their bosses, neighbors organize against their landlord. And to turn up pressure, they even do things like hold rallies and protests, sometimes lobby the government, or hit the nuclear option, a rent strike. And so I really wanted to look into this growing movement, and so we spoke to Tara Ragavir, who notably co-founded KC Tenants, the union in Kansas City, Missouri, with 3 other women back in 2019. With her saying tenant activism exploded nationwide once the pandemic shut everything down. And this had to do in part with the economic shock suddenly forcing people to come face to face with the possibility of eviction for the first time, though that fear was largely calmed down for the time being by government eviction moratoriums, rent caps, and rental assistance programs. And so with that, another factor Tara points out is just how much more important the home became for people's survival.
We were told to stay home, right? We were told to shelter in place. Our housing was the vaccine before the vaccine. It was the way that we were told to keep ourselves and our communities safe.
But for many people, that shelter was simply unaffordable, or at least the lockdown made the miserable quality of their home life impossible to ignore, whether it's because their apartment was in disrepair or they were living with an abuser. And so there was this growing sense that something was wrong. But as for who to blame, Tara spoke to a lot of people who were kind of confused.
We met people who felt alone and oftentimes had internalized a lot of shame about what was going on for them. We've got a hotline where people call from a place of crisis. And one of the first things we tell them is, you're not alone. What's happening to you is not your fault. You can actually do something about it if you organize with your neighbors.
And she adds that often people don't even understand what a tenant is, much less what a union is. So the first step is to build up that class consciousness. With Katie Goldstein, director of the Housing and Healthcare Campaigns of the Center for Popular Democracy, explaining.
But I think that the housing market in general has been pretty depoliticized. I think that people often think that housing, what kind of housing they have is based upon an individual choice, not actually a structural market that's operating in all kinds of ways that we don't have control over. But that is really beginning to change across the country as tenants become more organized and politicized.
Now, Goldstein says we don't have exact data on the number of tenant unions nationwide, but their membership is in the tens of thousands. And there's really no limit to the kinds of housing that can be organized, whether it's single-family homes, multi-family homes, senior living, student accommodation, even trailer parks. With that last one being surprisingly common. I mean, hell, I was even a trailer park kid. And there's an estimated 22 million households, or at least 1 in 15 Americans, living in mobile homes. And often, unlike with traditional housing, mobile home park landlords only own the land, not the actual home sitting on it. So that means they don't have to pay for all the typical maintenance and upkeep for those structures, which the tenants pay for themselves. Plus, the mobile home really doesn't mean much when it costs $5,000 or $6,000 to move one, which is why over 90% of them never budge once after their first installation. And so these landlords have a ton of leverage to raise rents, because if tenants don't like it, there's not a lot they can do about it. Never mind if they get evicted, in which case they may have to say goodbye to the property they've invested thousands of dollars and years of their lives into, all of which is why mobile home parks yield some of the highest returns in real estate, right? And it's that promise of a reliable revenue stream that inspired Frank Rolfe, who owns 250 such parks, to proclaim, we're like a Waffle House where everyone is chained to the booths. So it's not a surprise that big investment firms like Blackstone, the Carlyle Group, and Stockbridge Capital Group have scooped up large shares in this market. But they don't always just sit on the property and collect rent, right? Sometimes the investor sells the land to a developer, which kicks everyone off of it en masse and builds multi-million-dollar properties there instead. And often because these parks have been stigmatized by a number of things, I mean, hell, even including shows like Cops and Trailer Park Boys, often depicting the occupants as white trash, there's little support in government for zoning more mobile parks, let alone protecting existing ones. But if they band together under a tenant union, they might actually have a fighting chance, and some have actually done so in states across the country. Plus, their inclusion and organizing efforts has the potential to bridge racial and geographic divides. Our mobile home parks, mostly rented by rural white people in apartment buildings, often rented by Black and Hispanic people, are both owned by the same motherfuckers at the top. And it just takes the right organizer to help people realize that. Though do understand that's not to say that all tenants are equally easy to organize. Or with Tara saying that it's most difficult to rally the people who have become stuck in this constant churn of instability, right? They have multiple evictions, very low incomes, and seemingly no way out, which leaves them with nowhere to turn except what Tara calls the landlords of last resort, right? And those are the only property owners who will take them in, given their record, credit score, income, etc.
Those tenants, I think, are the hardest to organize, in part because the forces of capital keep them moving, right? By design, the business model of the landlords who rent to tenants like that is predicated on those tenants' instability. So it's hard to organize a building union when half the building is turning over within 6 months or a year because they're getting evicted, they're getting priced out, their leases aren't renewed, the conditions are so horrible that they're forced to leave.
And then she also told us about one of the most egregious cases she's ever had to fight. With that happening at a building that KC Tenants began organizing in late January because it lost heat during one of the coldest weekends of the year.
The school district called us they had students who were living in that building whose families were getting sick. And there was a risk that, especially some of the older people in the building, some folks who were already sick, might have frozen to death that weekend. The building is entirely Burmese refugees and Mexican immigrants, and almost no one on the property spoke English. We had to get the city involved because there were so many property violations. The city, to their credit, came out, kind of turned the whole health department inside out to make sure that folks were on site all weekend. And then by Monday, we got the heat and other utilities reinstated for the building. Trouble is, 2 days later, the local slumlord who owned the property when we were organizing sold it to an out-of-town landlord. And that landlord, 2 weeks after that, filed 30-day notices against all of the tenants in the building and said, you all have until the beginning of April to move out of this property. We're going to flip it and start renting these units that were rented for $350. We're going to rent them for $1,200.
And all these tenants are poor, right? They're on fixed incomes, many working multiple jobs. And so with basically nowhere else to go that they can afford, they're like, we literally cannot leave. We will not leave. And so they do the only thing they can. They reach out to KC Tenants. And the union bombards his cell phone with hundreds of texts after only getting his number because he went to the city to get tax incentives for another deal. Then he finally relents and negotiates with them, cutting a deal to let the tenants stay in their homes. And while they would only pay $400 in rent, the city would cover another $450, and that coming with strings attached. So now we can't evict them or raise rents for 2 years, and formal notices have been translated into their native languages. But Tara is saying that this story is nowhere near unique, though fortunately in this case they had a tenant union to back them up. But also saying she wants to see more arrangements like this on the federal level as well, where the government makes loans and subsidies conditional on landlords not raising rents more than a certain amount, say 3%. And one way it can do that is through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where these government-sponsored enterprises help institutional investors obtain hefty low-interest mortgages with few strings attached. But ironically, while their ostensible purpose is to help subsidize affordable housing, they arguably do the opposite, especially with mobile home parks. Right? Because when the landlords raise the rents, it boosts their cash flow, and that makes the land more valuable on paper and allows them to borrow more money against the property. And then, with that extra cash, they buy even more property and just repeat the process. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac just supercharge the corporate conquest of housing markets. But in theory, they could make their loans conditional on the landlords not raising rents or evicting tenants. And notably, those are two things corporate landlords are more inclined to do because of the financial pressure they feel to maximize profits for their shareholders. Right? In one study, for example, of single-family rentals in Fulton County, Georgia in 2015, institutional investors proved far more likely to pursue eviction than other landlords, with them filing evictions on 20% of tenants, a rate more than 3 times that of so-called mom-and-pop landlords. And subsequent studies in markets from Boston to Vegas have reached similar conclusions. And on the eviction front, the same logic applies, with investors often buying up rent-controlled apartments, then pressuring residents to leave and then selling those units at market rate instead. And that pressure can come in many forms, often through a so-called tenant relocator hired by the landlord to persuade tenants to accept a cash payout in exchange for moving. They'll also do things like threaten to evict or deport you, claim the building is being demolished, or lie about other tenants taking the money, all of which is especially frightening to immigrants who often speak very little English and are undocumented. So if they're going to have any hope at a defense, it's through a tenant union. But Tara says that corporate landlords are almost impenetrable to organizers.
First of all, it's so difficult for a tenant to know who their landlord actually is when private equity owns their home, because private equity will cover its tracks through a whole myriad of LLCs, a whole maze of property management companies and other contractors. And the tenant is left with really no clear path to the landlord. And that's by design, right? Private equity is shielding the owners and the investors from any kind of real accountability with the human beings on the other side of their investments.
But also, none of this is to say that mom and pop landlords are a perfect alternative, or they can be a less aggressive version of the same thing. But Tara argues that even they often function like corporations.
Even those, quote, mom and pop entities have LLCs that shield their actual ownership from their tenants. They might even contract with property management firms. A lot of the way that they do their business has adapted to follow the model of corporate landlording, which is much more dominant today than it was even a decade ago.
And so she says that KC Tenants is up against a tough political challenge, but by slowly growing their power and exerting constant pressure on the city, they've made some legislative gains. Things like passing a tenant's bill of rights, for example, or a guaranteed right to an attorney for tenants in eviction court. With that one not just giving them a fairer shot at keeping their homes, it also disincentivizes landlords from hitting the evict button in the first place, right? Because with a guaranteed lawyer on the other side fighting for the tenant, evicting them becomes much more of a legal headache. And so you have one attorney who represents Kansas City landlords saying last October that the cost of an eviction eviction had risen by a factor of 5, and saying the process now took from 3 months to a year, up from a month or so before. Though part of that was also due to KC Tenants' activism. Right in July of 2020, for example, after the local eviction moratorium ended, they tried to delay virtual eviction court hearings by logging onto Zoom calls and chanting every eviction is an act of violence over and over so nobody could actually hear each other. Then in October, they chained themselves to the courthouse doors, even taking their protests to the front yard of a judge. And all these methods reaching a fever pitch in what the union dubbed Zero Eviction January, when they prevented 90% of scheduled evictions across 2 counties that month. But again, as Tara explains, it is an uphill battle when you're fighting the powers that be in local politics.
Our city is bought and sold by private developers and landlords in many ways, right? This is not unique to Kansas City. This is the truth everywhere. Real estate capital is the most potent political force in local elections and in local governance.
But that hasn't stopped her from trying, like with an eye-catching protest at the Starlight Theater in August, where Mayor Quinton Lucas, a Democrat, had a cameo in a local play, but a half dozen hecklers from KC Tenants berated his housing plan from the audience. A plan where he proposed issuing $50 million in bonds to fund low-income housing. But at the same time, he wanted to loosen regulations on a program previously encouraging affordable housing and otherwise market-rate projects. So in effect, developers would be able to replace units meant for low-income families with those meant for middle income. And so 2 days after the protest, KC Tenants members filed into the city council chambers for the vote, which favored the proposal 9-4, causing one member to yell, "How dare you," and security hauling her out with her hands behind her back. Then another member yelling, "Not another penny for the slumlords," which promptly got her not only kicked out, but arrested and taken to jail. So if it wasn't clear by that point, the union knew that it really needed some political power. And actually, to that end, its sister organization, KC Tenants Power, got a union leader elected to city council last month. And actually, 4 of the 6 candidates they endorsed won. And so while progress is slow, Tara says they ultimately want to see Kansas City invest in municipal social housing. Right? It's outside the private sector, backed by public funding, and democratically controlled by the tenants who live in it. And actually, on the federal level, Biden's early plans for infrastructure included a proposal to invest $40 billion in public housing. Though by the time his 2021 infrastructure bill and 2022 Inflation Reduction Act were signed into law, the proposal had vanished. And so I guess with all that said, if you are interested in learning more or doing some work yourself, Tara's union has an organizing toolkit online that you can read for tips and strategy. I'm going to link to it in the description. And for everyone else, I know this was a beefy story, and so I want to pass the question off to you. What are your thoughts and experiences with this? But that is where today's daily dive into the news is going to end, though do not worry, because after you hit that like button to support today's show, I got you covered for more news you need to know right here or in the top links in the description. Or if you're all caught up, don't worry.